Can I stay just one night? The Omega whispered, unaware it was the Alpha King's cabin. Can I stay just one night? Gabriella whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing instantly swallowed by the howling blizzard. She clutched her torn cloak against the biting wind, the snow slowly freezing the blood on her bare, bruised calves. The heavy oak door of the cabin had swung open, revealing a sheer wall of muscle and shadow. The man standing in the threshold was a monolith, silhouetted by the dying embers of the hearth inside. He didn't speak. He didn't move, but the sheer weight of his presence, the heavy, suffocating aura of an apex predator, pressed the last breath from her lungs. She had sought desperate refuge. She had no idea she had just knocked on the Alpha King's door. The winter woods of the Northern Territory did not forgive. They were an ancient, sprawling graveyard of pine and frost, where the weak became marrow for the earth, and only the most ruthless survived. For 3 days, Gabriella had been running. Her lungs were lined with shards of ice. Every inhalation a ragged, burning tear through her chest. Her bare feet, long since stripped of her thin leather boots by the cruel roots and jagged rocks of the forest floor, left pale, bloody stamps in the knee-deep snow. She was an Omega, a caste meant for hearths, soft linens, and the protective embrace of a pack. But her pack was ashes now, consumed by the rogue wolves that still hunted her through the unrelenting blizzard. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It was a living entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped around her fragile bones, lulling her toward a sleep she knew she would never wake from. The edges of her vision had begun to blur into a soft, dizzying white, the scent of her own fear, a sharp, sour note of crushed winter berries turning bitter, was masked only by the overpowering smell of ozone and approaching death. Then, she saw it. It was nothing more than a shadow against the stark white of the mountainside, a shape too geometric to be natural rock or fallen timber. A cabin. It clung to the edge of a jagged cliff, its dark timber walls blending seamlessly into the dense ancient pines that shielded it from the worst of the howling wind. A thin, frail ribbon of gray smoke, curled from a stone chimney, instantly snatched away by the gale. Fire. Warmth. Gabriella didn't think. Instinct, raw and desperate, seized control of her failing limbs. She dragged herself through the final, brutal snowdrift, her fingers numb and blue as they clawed at the frozen earth. When she finally reached the heavy wooden porch, she practically collapsed against the thick, iron-bound oak of the door. She raised a trembling, frostbitten fist and struck the wood. Once. Twice. The sound was pitiful, barely louder than the snap of a frozen twig, entirely lost to the roar of the wind. She leaned her forehead against the rough grain of the door, tears freezing onto her eyelashes before they could even fall. Please, she prayed to the moon goddess, her inner wolf whimpering in the dark, cold corners of her soul. Just one night. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed from within. They were slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that made the floorboards groan in protest. Gabriella's breath caught in her throat. Her Omega instincts flared. A sudden, blinding warning screaming in her mind to run, to flee back into the storm. The scent bleeding through the cracks of the door was overwhelming. It smelled of dark, crushed pine needles, the violent electricity of a lightning strike, and raw, untamed earth. It was the scent of an alpha, but amplified to a terrifying, suffocating degree. Before she could push herself away, the heavy iron latch clicked. The door swung inward, moving silently on well-oiled hinges, pulling the bitter wind into the cabin. Gabriella fell forward, catching herself on the doorframe. She looked up, her vision swimming, and met the imposing wall of a chest draped in a thick, dark wool sweater. She tilted her head further back, her neck aching, to find the face of the man who lived at the edge of the world. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the firelight behind him entirely. His face was a landscape of harsh, unforgiving angles, a strong, unshaven jaw, high cheekbones, and dark, unruly hair that fell across his forehead. But it was his eyes that stole the last remnants of her breath. They were shadowed, heavy with an exhaustion that seemed older than the mountains. Yet beneath that weariness lay a coiled, dangerous lethality. He stared down at her in absolute, terrifying silence. "Can I stay just one night?" Gabriella whispered, her voice cracking, her trembling frame giving out. The massive stranger did not answer. He simply looked at the blood on the snow, the bruised blue tinge of her skin, and the wild, hunted look in her eyes. His nostrils flared, taking in her scent. The air between them grew thick, humming with a sudden, violent tension. Gabriella felt her knees finally buckle under the crushing weight of his aura. As she fell toward the frozen wooden planks, a massive, scarred hand shot out, catching her arm with a grip that was shockingly gentle. He stepped back, pulling her out of the storm and into the suffocating heat of the cabin. As the heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, plunging the world into sudden, quiet firelight, Gabriella looked up to see his eyes catch the flames. For a fraction of a second, the human darkness in his irises burned away, replaced by the molten, glowing gold of a sovereign wolf. She had not found a simple woodsman. She had found a monster. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, save for the aggressive, hungry crackle of the massive logs burning in the stone hearth. The sudden shift from the frozen, howling void outside to the blistering heat of the interior was agonizing. Gabriella's nerve endings screamed as the warmth hit her frostbitten skin. She slumped onto a thick, incredibly soft fur rug laid out before the fire, her body violently shivering as her blood sluggishly began to move again. She curled in on herself, a defensive ball of torn fabric and bruising, her wide eyes tracking the massive man as he moved through the space. The cabin was surprisingly Spartan, stripped of any luxury. There were no tapestries, no gilded mirrors, nothing but raw, polished wood, heavy iron implements, and the smell of dried herbs, leather, and that overwhelming, suffocating scent of petrichor and pine. The stranger moved with a terrifying grace for a man of his size. There was no wasted motion, no sound to his footsteps. He was a shadow detaching itself from the darker corners of the room. He walked to an iron basin resting on a cast-iron stove in the corner, poured steaming water into a wooden bowl, and grabbed a stack of clean white cloths. When he turned back to her, Gabriella pushed herself backward against the floorboards, her heart hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. He stopped. The golden hue had faded from his eyes, leaving them a dark, stormy gray, but the predator within him was practically vibrating beneath his skin. He sank to his haunches, his sheer size dwarfing her completely. He set the bowl down between them, the steam rising like a fragile curtain. He didn't offer comforting words. He didn't ask her name, or who was hunting her. He simply extended one large, deeply calloused hand toward her frozen, bleeding feet. Gabriella flinched, pulling her legs tight against her chest. "Don't," she breathed, the word barely a rasp. The man paused. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath his skin. He slowly lowered his hand, resting it on his own knee, and held her gaze. The emotional subtext in the room was deafening. Her scent was spiking with terror, filling the small space with the smell of sour panic. His scent, in response, flared with a deep, rumbling wave of earth and ancient forest, instinctively trying to blanket hers, to force the frantic Omega energy into a state of calm. It was an involuntary alpha response, a biological mandate to soothe a distressed pack member. But they were not pack. They were strangers. For the first time, he spoke. "The frost will take your toes by morning if the blood doesn't flow," he said. His voice was a low, seismic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and settled directly in the marrow of her bones. It was a voice used to commanding armies, a voice that did not know how to ask, only how to decree. Yet, now, it was startlingly quiet. He didn't move toward her again. He simply waited. He was giving her the illusion of choice, though they both knew her survival depended on his mercy. Trembling, Gabriella slowly extended her right leg. The moment his fingers wrapped around her ankle, a jolt of pure, static electricity shot up her calf. He was burning hot. The contrast of his feverish heat against her frozen skin was a sharp, beautiful agony. He dipped a cloth into the hot water and began to meticulously clean the blood, dirt, and ice from her torn soles. His touch was a revelation. Hands that looked capable of snapping a bear's neck were moving with the precision and care of a jeweler handling shattered glass. Gabriella watched, mesmerized and terrified, as he cleaned every scrape, his thumbs occasionally brushing against the sensitive arches of her feet, sending involuntary shivers up her spine. As the pain of the thaw set in, tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, tracking silently through the grime on her cheeks. He didn't look up, but his jaw clenched tighter, his own chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled rhythm, as if he were breathing through her pain for her. When he finished, he rose silently, crossing the room to a heavy wooden chest. He pulled out a massive, folded blanket of thick gray wool. He walked back to her and draped it over her shivering shoulders. Gabriella pulled the heavy fabric tightly around herself, burying her nose into the collar to breathe in the residual heat. As she adjusted the folds, her fingertips brushed against something stiff embroidered into the corner of the fabric. She looked down. In the flickering orange light of the fire, the silver thread gleamed like a drawn blade. It was a crest, a snarling wolf's head, crowned with winter thorns. Set against the backdrop of a crescent moon, the air left her lungs in a sharp, silent gasp. Every pup in the Northern Territory knew that crest. It was stamped on the coins. It was flown on the banners of the capital. It was the seal of the royal house. She wasn't in the cabin of a hermit. She was wrapped in the blanket of King Garrett, the alpha of alphas, the ruthless ruler who despised the weakness of the lower castes and ruled the territories with an iron, blood-soaked fist. She slowly lifted her eyes, her blood running colder than the storm outside, to find Garrett staring down at her. He had seen her recognize the crest, and in the depths of his stormy gray eyes, the ancient, feral wolf was watching her back. The fire popped, a loud, sharp crack like a breaking bone, but neither of them blinked. Gabriella felt the sudden, desperate urge to strip the heavy blanket from her shoulders, as if the royal crest burned like a brand against her skin. This was Garrett, the man who had slaughtered the Southern Rebellion single-handedly. The monarch who lived by the ancient, archaic laws that dictated Omegas were meant to be sequestered, managed, and controlled. To be an unbonded rogue Omega in his presence was not just dangerous. By the old laws, it was practically a crime. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird throwing itself against a cage. The scent of her terror skyrocketed. A sharp, metallic spike that tasted like copper in the air. Garrett's reaction was entirely silent, but devastating in its intensity. He didn't step toward her. He didn't speak a word, but his chest expanded as he took a slow, deep breath, pulling her terrified scent deep into his lungs. His hands, hanging loosely at his sides, curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. The tendons in his thick neck stood out like steel cables. He was fighting his own beast. Gabriella could see it in the slight tremor of his broad shoulders, in the way the shadows in the room seemed to lean toward him, bending to the gravitational pull of his massive aura. His inner wolf, the primal Alpha King, was thrashing against the cage of his human restraint, demanding that he step forward, demand her submission, and claim the distressed Omega in his territory. Instead, Garrett closed his eyes. He turned his back to her, facing the roaring fire. He placed both hands on the heavy stone mantelpiece, his head bowing slightly, his knuckles turning stark white. "Drink the water," he commanded to the flames, his voice rougher now, lined with a gravelly strain that hadn't been there before. "Sleep. You will not be harmed here." Gabriella barely dared to breathe. She looked at the wooden bowl of water he had left near the rug. Her throat was a desert, cracked and bleeding, but moving meant drawing his attention. Yet, the deep, resonant tone of his command bypassed her rational fear, plucking directly at the primal Omega strings within her. Her body obeyed before her mind could protest. She crawled an inch forward, her trembling hands wrapping around the warm wooden bowl. She brought it to her lips and drank. It was just water, but it tasted like life itself. She retreated back to her corner of the rug, pulling her knees to her chest, hiding herself entirely beneath the king's blanket. She watched his broad back. He remained completely motionless, a statue carved from obsidian and firelight. Why was he here? The king belonged in the obsidian fortress of the capital, surrounded by guards and courtiers, not isolated in a freezing, forgotten cabin at the edge of the world. Rumors had whispered through the territories that the king was suffering from the feral blight, a condition where an alpha, burdened by too much blood and power without a destined mate to anchor them, slowly lost their humanity to the beast within. Was this his exile? Was he out here to lose his mind in the snow? Hours bled away into the dark. The storm outside raged on, hurling sheets of ice against the small windows, a relentless assault on their fragile sanctuary. Eventually, exhaustion claimed Gabriella. She didn't mean to sleep. She meant to keep watch, to be ready to run if he turned on her. but the heat of the fire, heavy, grounding scent of his pine and ozone aura, and the absolute physical collapse of her body dragged her down into the dark. Sometime deep in the night, she shifted in her sleep. A whimper tore from her throat as a nightmare of rogue teeth and tearing flesh gripped her mind. She thrashed, throwing her arm out from beneath the blanket. Her cold hand struck something incredibly warm. Gabriella gasped, her eyes snapping open. Garrett was sitting on the floor just a few feet away, his back against a wooden chair, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. He had been keeping watch. In her sleep, she had reached out, and her delicate, bruised fingers were now resting flat against his thick forearm. She froze, terrified to pull away, terrified to stay. Garrett didn't move. He looked down at her small, pale hand resting against his scarred olive skin. The contrast was striking. Then, ever so slowly, he turned his head to look at her. The stormy gray of his eyes was gone, replaced entirely by that glowing, sovereign gold. A spark, hot and electric, snapped beneath her skin where they touched. It wasn't just heat. It was a profound, soul-deep hum that bypassed her fear and settled directly in the empty, aching center of her chest. Garrett's breath hitched, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He felt it too. The ancient, impossible pull of fate. Before either of them could pull away, the sound of the storm outside suddenly died. The wind ceased its howling, leaving a heavy, unnatural silence in its wake. Then, cutting through the frozen night, a jagged, blood-curdling howl shattered the air. It was close. Too close. It was the rogues. They had followed the scent of her blood. Gabriella's blood ran ice-cold. She snatched her hand back, curling into a tight ball of terror. Garrett didn't look at her. He didn't show an ounce of fear. The Alpha King simply stood up in one fluid, terrifyingly graceful motion. He turned toward the heavy oak door, his broad shoulders blocking it entirely, as a second howl joined the first. His hands flexed at his sides, and with a sharp, sickening snick, pitch-black claws extended from his fingertips, digging deep into the floorboards. The air in the cabin turned sharp, brittle enough to snap. Gabriella scrambled backward, the thick gray blanket pooling around her waist as she pressed her spine against the rough stones of the hearth. Her inner wolf clawed at her mind, a frantic, high-pitched frequency of pure survival instinct. The rogues. There had been 5 of them tracking her massive, starved beasts, driven mad by winter and bloodlust. She opened her mouth to warn him, to tell him how many there were, but the words died in her throat. Garrett did not require a warning. He did not grab the heavy iron broadsword resting against the far wall. He didn't even reach for a hunting knife. He merely stood before the heavy oak door, the muscles of his broad back expanding beneath his dark sweater as he inhaled deeply, pulling the scent of the intruders through the wooden planks. Another howl ripped through the silence, this one vibrating with a vicious, mocking hunger. It was followed by the heavy, crunching sounds of massive paws breaking through the crust of the snow. They were circling the cabin. Garrett reached out, his clawed hand resting on the iron latch. He looked back over his shoulder. The molten gold in his eyes was blinding now, a terrifying beacon in the dim light of the cabin. "Do not move from the fire," he commanded. It wasn't a request. The sheer alpha weight in his voice pinned Gabriella to the rug, forcing her chin down in an involuntary display of submission. Then, he opened the door and stepped out into the frozen abyss. The wind immediately shrieked into the cabin, biting at the dying embers. But Gabriella couldn't feel the cold. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone in the agonizing silence. For 3 excruciating heartbeats, there was nothing but the whistle of the wind. Then, the mountain erupted. It started with a roar, a sound so ancient, so unfathomably loud and vicious that the wooden beams of the ceiling physically trembled. It wasn't the sound of a man. It was the battle cry of the apex predator, the true sovereign of the Northern Territory unleashing the beast he kept buried beneath a crown of thorns. The roar was immediately followed by the sickening, wet sound of tearing flesh and the high-pitched, aborted yelp of a massive canine. Gabriella slapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, but she couldn't drown out the symphony of violence occurring just inches beyond the wood. She heard the heavy thud of bodies slamming against the exterior walls, shaking the cabin to its foundations. She heard the snaps of thick bones breaking under immense pressure, the guttural snarls of desperate, dying rogues, and above it all, the terrifying, rhythmic breathing of the king. She crawled toward the small, frosted window near the door, her trembling fingers wiping away a small patch of ice to look out into the night. The moonlight cut through the falling snow, illuminating a scene of absolute brutal mastery. Garrett had not fully shifted into his wolf form. He was in the lethal, terrifying half-state that only the most powerful alphas could maintain human in stature, but gifted with the lethal weapons of the wolf. His sweater was torn, revealing the corded, scarred muscles of his chest. His hands were dripping with dark, steaming blood, his claws extended to their full, horrifying length. 3 massive, mangy rogue wolves lay motionless in the snow, the pristine white powder around them turning a rapid, spreading black in the moonlight. The remaining 2 rogues were circling him, their lips curled back over yellowed fangs, their bodies lowered in defensive panic. They had expected to find a fragile, terrified Omega. They had found the Grim Reaper. One of the rogues lunged, a desperate, suicidal leap, aimed at Garrett's throat. Garrett didn't step back. He met the massive beast midair. His arm shot out in a blur of motion, his hand wrapping around the thick, furry throat of the rogue. With a brutal, twisting motion that required impossible strength, he slammed the beast down into the frozen earth. The crack of the wolf's spine echoed sharply against the cliffside. The final rogue didn't hesitate. It broke, turning its tail and scrambling frantically back toward the tree line, whimpering in absolute terror. Garrett let it run. He stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, the steam rolling off his overheated skin in thick waves. He raised his head to the moon, and a deep, rattling growl vibrated from his chest, staking his claim over the territory, over the blood spilled, and over the life he had protected inside. Gabriella scrambled away from the window, her heart attempting to beat its way out of her chest. She retreated back to the hearth, curling herself into a tiny, trembling ball. A moment later, the heavy iron latch clicked again. The door opened. Garrett stepped back inside, bringing the metallic, coppery scent of fresh blood and the sharp bite of winter with him. He kicked the door shut, locking it with a heavy thud. Gabriella looked up at him. He was covered in blood, none of it his own, save for a long, jagged tear across his left bicep, where a set of desperate fangs had managed to graze him. His chest rose and fell in harsh, ragged gasps. The feral beast was still completely at the surface, his golden eyes blown wide, his fangs still partially extended, catching the firelight. He locked eyes with her. The predator in him was high on the kill, surging with territorial dominance. He took a slow, heavy step toward her, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Gabriella's breath hitched. She pressed herself harder against the stone, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and an inexplicable, soul-deep awe. He was a monster, but he was her monster. The thought bloomed unbidden in the back of her mind, a terrifying whisper of the mate bond attempting to take root. Garrett stopped 3 feet away from her. He looked down at his blood-soaked hands, then up at her pale, terrified face. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame as the man fought to wrestle the beast back into its cage. He closed his eyes, his jaw clamping shut so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. When he opened them again, the gold was slowly bleeding away, retreating back into the stormy gray of the king. He looked at the deep gash on his arm, then back to the fire. He hadn't spoken a word, but the heavy silence of the cabin was thick with a new, undeniable truth. The king had spilled blood for her, and the night was far from over. The scent of blood in the enclosed space was intoxicating, heavy, and raw. It clashed violently with the lingering smell of ozone and pine, creating an atmosphere so thick Gabriella felt as though she were breathing underwater. Garrett moved to the far corner of the cabin, distancing himself from her with deliberate, rigid steps. He stripped off the ruined wool sweater, the fabric tearing easily under his powerful hands, and threw it into a wooden bin. In the flickering orange light of the hearth, his torso was a map of brutal history. Faded white lines crisscrossed over deep, jagged scars, the testament of a king who led from the front lines, who bled for his crown rather than hiding behind it. But Gabriella's eyes were drawn to the fresh wound on his left bicep. It wasn't a deep bite, just a grazing tear, but it wasn't acting like a normal wound. Instead of the rapid, almost instantaneous healing that defined werewolf biology, the edges of the gash were dark, angry, and weeping a thin, blackish fluid. The rogue's bite carried a foul, rotting bacteria, but an alpha of Garrett's bloodline should have burned it out in seconds. Unless the rumors were true. Unless the feral blight was already eating away at his immune system, degrading his healing factor as it slowly consumed his mind. Garrett walked to the iron basin, poured cold water over a cloth, and pressed it roughly against his arm. A low, guttural hiss escaped his lips, his muscles bunching as he leaned heavily against the wooden counter. He was in pain, more pain than a simple scratch should cause. Gabriella watched him from the safety of the hearth. Her Omega instincts, previously drowning in a sea of terror, suddenly flared with a different, equally powerful mandate. Heal, nurture, protect the pack. She bit her lower lip, fighting the internal war. He was the Alpha King. He was terrifying, but he was bleeding, and his aura, usually a suffocating wall of dominance, was fluctuating, shivering with an underlying note of profound exhaustion and fever. Slowly, she pushed the heavy gray blanket off her shoulders. The cold air of the cabin bit at her thin, torn dress, but she ignored it. She pushed herself up onto her bruised, aching feet. Her legs trembled violently, protesting the movement, but she forced herself to take a step, then another. The soft padding of her bare feet on the wooden planks was nearly silent, but Garrett's head snapped toward her instantly. His eyes narrowed, a flash of warning gold bleeding back into his irises. "Stay by the fire," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp. He turned his back to her, gripping the edges of the counter until the wood splintered beneath his fingers. Gabriella didn't stop. The invisible tether connecting them, the impossible magnetic pull that had sparked when they touched earlier, was dragging her across the room. She stopped just behind his broad, scarred back. Up close, the heat radiating off his body was immense, like standing beside an open furnace. He was running a dangerous fever. "Your healing is slowed," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fire. The blight. Garrett stiffened. The muscles in his back turned to absolute stone. For a moment, she thought he might turn and strike her for daring to speak of the royal secret, for acknowledging his weakness. Instead, his head bowed lower. "It is not for you to concern yourself with, little wolf," he said, the words strained, forced out through clenched teeth. "Go back to the fire. You fought for me," Gabriella replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. She reached out, her small, trembling hands hovering just inches from the expanse of his bare back. "Let me help." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. An Omega tending to a cursed king. "The laws would have us both hanged." "There are no laws out here," she said softly. Before her courage could fail her, she pressed her palms flat against his burning skin, right between his shoulder blades. Garrett inhaled sharply, a violent, full-body shudder ripping through him. His head fell back, a strangled groan tearing from his throat. The moment her skin met his, that electric golden spark erupted again. But this time, it wasn't just a shock. It was a current. Gabriella closed her eyes, tapping into the deep, latent energy of her caste. Omegas were the heart of the pack, gifted with the ability to soothe, to anchor, and to draw out pain. She pushed a wave of calm, cooling energy through her palms and into his fevered body. She felt the immediate, physical reaction of his inner beast. The feral wolf, thrashing in the dark corners of his mind, suddenly quieted, lulled into a state of stunned docility by her touch. The suffocating weight of his alpha aura softened, transforming from a crushing pressure into a heavy, protective blanket. Slowly, Garrett turned around. He looked down at her, his chest heaving. The fever was still burning in his eyes, but the feral madness was retreating. Without breaking eye contact, he lowered himself down, sitting on the edge of a heavy wooden bench, bringing himself closer to her height. He extended his injured arm toward her, offering the bleeding wound in a silent gesture of profound, terrifying trust. Gabriella moved to his side. She took the bloodied cloth from his hand, her fingers brushing against his. She moved to the hearth, retrieved the bowl of hot water he had used for her feet, and brought it back. With excruciating gentleness, she began to clean the wound. She wiped away the blackish fluid, her touch light as a feather. With every pass of the cloth, she pushed her calming energy into his skin. Garrett watched her face, his gaze tracing the delicate lines of her jaw, the dark bruising beneath her eyes, the sheer, terrified bravery it took for her to stand so close to him. His breathing slowed, syncing with hers in a quiet, rhythmic dance. As the last of the infection was washed away, Gabriella watched in awe as the edges of the laceration finally began to knit together. The king's natural healing factor jump-started by her proximity and care. She tied a strip of clean linen around his bicep, pulling the knot tight. "It will heal now," she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the bandage, suddenly overwhelmed by the intense, heavy silence between them. She tried to step back, to retreat to the safety of the hearth, but a massive, incredibly warm hand wrapped gently around her wrist. Gabriella froze. She finally looked up, meeting his stormy gray eyes. The distance between them had vanished. He was so close she could feel the heat of his breath against her cheek. The air grew thick, heavy with the undeniable gravitational pull of a bond that defied everything they knew. Garrett's thumb slowly brushed across the fragile, racing pulse at her wrist. His eyes darkened, focusing on her lips, and for one suspended, breathless second, the king leaned in. The heavy timber of the cabin creaked, as the wind outside finally began to lose its lethal velocity. But inside, the atmosphere was pulled taut as a bowstring. Garrett's thumb continued its slow, hypnotic sweep over Gabriella's pulse point. The rhythm of her heart was frantic, a hummingbird trapped against glass. But the scent of her fear had completely evaporated. In its place was something entirely different. The sweet, dizzying fragrance of night-blooming jasmine and crushed vanilla. The scent of an omega in the presence of her recognized mate. Garrett closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as if in sudden, sharp pain. The feral beast within him, previously lulled by her healing touch, was now pacing frantically, demanding he close the final inch, demanding he claim what the moon goddess had thrown to his doorstep. But the man, the king who had seen too much blood, who knew the curse running through his own veins, fought back. With a ragged intake of breath, Garrett released her wrist. He pushed himself off the wooden bench, putting a sudden, jarring expanse of space between them. He turned his back, walking to the frosted window, wiping away the condensation to look out at the dying storm. The sudden loss of his heat left Gabriella shivering. Her skin burned where he had touched her, a phantom warmth that made her ache. She wrapped her arms around her own waist, confused and adrift in the sudden emotional whiplash. "You shouldn't have touched me," Garrett said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely carried over the crackle of the fire. "I healed you," Gabriella replied, her voice trembling slightly, though she refused to back down. "You chained a beast that is meant to die in the snow," he countered, his tone bitter, laced with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the graying light of the approaching dawn. "The blight isn't a simple fever, little wolf. It is the toll of the crown. It is the blood of the rebellion, the weight of 1,000 executions, festering in the soul of an alpha without a mate to anchor him." He turned fully to face her, the stormy gray of his eyes heavy with sorrow. "I came to this cabin to isolate myself, to wait for the madness to take me fully, so that when I finally snapped, I wouldn't slaughter my own court. I came here to die, Gabriella." It was the first time he had spoken her name. Hearing it roll off his tongue, wrapped in that deep, resonant baritone, sent a shiver straight down her spine. "But you didn't die," she said softly, taking a single brave step toward him. "You fought the rogues. You protected me. The madness hasn't taken you. Because of you," he breathed, the admission seemingly tearing itself from his throat. "The moment you crossed that threshold, the moment you touched me, the fever broke." The beast quieted. He looked down at his own hands, flexing the long, scarred fingers. "You are an unbonded omega, and I am a king dying of a feral curse. The bond pulling at us. It is the goddess's final, cruel joke." "It isn't a joke," Gabriella whispered. The truth of it settled heavily in her chest. A warm, terrifying reality. She had spent her entire life hiding her caste, fearing the brutal pack dynamics that turned omegas into little more than prized possessions. But looking at the terrifying, lethal king before her, she didn't feel possessed. She felt anchored. "If I claim you," Garrett warned, his voice dropping an octave, raw with restrained desire, "the blight will recede. But you will be bound to a monster. You will wear a crown forged in blood. and the court will tear you apart for your caste. I have been torn apart my whole life, Gabriella replied, lifting her chin, her eyes catching the firelight. I ran through a blizzard to survive. I can survive a court. Garrett stared at her, the sheer, resilient strength of her spirit, leaving him momentarily speechless. The fragile, broken girl who had begged for one night was gone. In her place stood a queen, forged in ice and survival. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the space between them evaporating once more. He reached out, his massive hands gently cupping her face. His thumbs brushed away the dried tear tracks on her cheeks. One night, he murmured, his forehead resting gently against hers, the heat of his skin seeping into her bones. You asked for one night. I changed my mind, she breathed, her hands coming up to grip the thick muscles of his forearms. As his lips brushed against hers, a soft, tentative touch that sent a jolt of pure, blinding electricity through them both. The absolute silence of the cabin was suddenly, violently shattered. From the valley below, cutting through the crisp, clear air of the morning dawn, the deep, resonant blast of a war horn echoed against the mountainside. Garrett froze, tearing his lips from hers, his head snapping toward the window. The gold flared violently in his eyes. A second horn answered the first, much closer this time. It wasn't the rogues. It was the royal guard. The king's trackers had found his exile, and they were coming up the mountain, bringing the vicious, unforgiving world of the capital right to their doorstep. The romantic tension in the cabin fractured like thin ice under a heavy iron boot. The reverberation of the war horns had barely faded, before the unmistakable sound of heavily armored wolves pushing through the snowdrifts echoed from the ridge. Garrett stepped back from Gabriella. The tender, vulnerable man who had just leaned his forehead against hers vanished instantly. In his place stood the sovereign. He moved toward the dark wooden chest at the foot of the bed, his spine straight, the casual lethality returning to his every motion. He pulled out a thick, black leather tunic and a heavy fur-lined cloak, throwing them on over his bare, scarred torso. Gabriella watched, her heart sinking. The king was donning his armor, preparing to face the court that demanded his absolute cruelty. He turned to her, holding a second, equally thick black cloak. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders, the heavy material swallowing her small frame entirely. His massive hands lingered for a fraction of a second on her collarbones, pulling the heavy fur hood up to obscure her face. He was burying her beneath his scent, masking the sweet, night-blooming jasmine of her omega nature with the suffocating, territorial pine of his own. "Do not speak," Garrett commanded, his voice devoid of the warmth from moments ago. It was a flat, imperious order. "Do not lower your eyes, but do not challenge them. You are under my shadow now." Before Gabriella could nod, the heavy thud of a gauntleted fist slammed against the oak door. Garrett didn't flinch. He walked to the door and threw the latch. The wind howled into the cabin once more, but this time, it brought with it the metallic tang of cold steel and the harsh, disciplined scent of a dozen alpha warriors. Standing on the blood-stained porch was the captain of the vanguard. He was a tall, severe man with a face scarred by countless border wars. His armor painted the matte, light-swallowing black of the king's personal guard. The captain's eyes immediately fell to the mangled corpses of the rogue wolves littering the snow, then slowly rose to meet Garrett's. He dropped to one knee, driving his fist against his breastplate in a crisp salute. The dozen men behind him mirrored the action, a wave of dark steel sinking into the snow. "My king," the captain rasped, his eyes daring to flicker toward the shadows of the cabin. "We tracked the rogues. We feared the blight had left you vulnerable to an ambush." Garrett stepped fully onto the threshold, his massive frame blocking the interior. His golden eyes flared, a physical pressure rolling off him in waves that forced the kneeling men to bow their heads even lower. "I require no saving, Kalen." Captain Kalen swallowed hard, the tendons in his neck straining against the oppressive weight of his king's aura. But his alpha senses were sharp. Beneath the heavy smell of pine and blood, he caught the faint, undeniable sweetness of vanilla. Kalen's eyes darted past Garrett's massive shoulder, landing on the small, hooded figure standing by the dying hearth. A low, involuntary growl of suspicion vibrated in the captain's throat. An Omega. Unmarked. In the king's private exile. Under the old laws, such an anomaly was a profound threat to the pack hierarchy. "You harbor a stray, sire?" Kaelin asked, the word dripping with an elite alpha's inherent disdain for the lower castes. The laws decree any unbonded Omega found beyond the borders must be sent to the cloisters for processing. Allow me to relieve you of the burden. Kaelin rose slightly, his hand resting instinctively on the pommel of his broadsword. The reaction was instantaneous. Garrett didn't draw a weapon. He simply took one step forward, off the porch and into the snow. The earth seemed to physically shudder beneath his boots. A low, bone-rattling snarl tore from Garrett's chest, a sound so ancient and dominant that two of the vanguards in the back row whimpered and pressed their faces into the frozen dirt. Touch the pommel of your sword in her presence again, Kaelin, Garrett whispered, his voice a lethal, deadly calm. And I will feed your heart to the crows. Kaelin froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock. The king had never defended an Omega. The king despised the weakness of the old ways. Yet here he was, bristling with the terrifying, possessive rage of a true mate defending his Luna. She returns with us to the Obsidian Court, Garrett declared to the frozen, terrified vanguard, his voice ringing off the jagged cliffs, and you will guard her back to my throne, as if she were the very blood in your veins. Am I understood? Yes, my king. Kaelin stammered, abandoning his sword and bowing so deeply his forehead brushed the snow. Garrett turned back, extending a massive, leather-clad hand into the shadows of the cabin. Gabriella, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm of fear and awe, stepped forward. She placed her small hand in his. His grip was an iron promise. As she stepped out into the blinding white of the morning, surrounded by the most lethal warriors in the territory, the king did not let go. The descent from the mountain was a brutal, silent march. Gabriella rode atop a massive, coal-black warhorse, seated directly in front of Garrett. His arms were heavy iron bands around her waist, shielding her from the biting wind and the hostile stares of the vanguard. He was a furnace against her back, his heartbeat a steady, reassuring drum beneath the thick leather of his armor. As they broke through the ancient pine forests, the capital revealed itself. The Obsidian Court was a terrifying monument to the harshness of the Northern Territory. It was a fortress carved directly into the face of a black, jagged mountain, its towering spires resembling the fangs of a massive beast. There was no warmth here, no banners of vibrant color, only the dark, unyielding reality of absolute power. As they rode through the massive iron gates, the city paused. The scent of 1,000 wolves hit Gabriella like a physical blow. It was a chaotic symphony of fear, ambition, dominance, and survival. The courtyard was lined with the nobility of the pack, lords and ladies wrapped in expensive furs, their eyes sharp and calculating. When they saw the king, a ripple of murmurs broke through the crowd. They had expected him to return mad, consumed by the feral blight, ready to be quietly dethroned by the ambitious council. Instead, Garrett sat tall, his eyes clear, his aura a suffocating blanket of total control. But the murmurs turned into a sharp, unified hiss of collective shock as their eyes landed on Gabriella. The heavy hood of her cloak had fallen back, revealing her bruised face and the undeniable, sweet scent of her caste. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the predatory instinct of 100 alphas wanting to challenge the anomaly of an Omega sitting on the king's mount. Do not lower your eyes. Garrett's command echoed in her mind. Gabriella straightened her spine. Her legs still ached, her feet were wrapped in bandages, and she was wearing a torn dress beneath a borrowed cloak. But she refused to cower. She was a survivor. She had outrun death in the blizzard. She would not be intimidated by courtiers in silk. She met the stares of the nobility with a calm, unwavering gaze, her inner wolf standing tall in the face of their disdain. Garrett dismounted effortlessly, the crowd parting before him like water before a ship. He reached up, grasping Gabriella by the waist, and lifted her down. Instead of handing her off to a servant or a guard, as was the custom for dealing with the lower castes, he laced his fingers through hers in full view of the court. A collective gasp echoed off the black stone walls. It was an unprecedented display, an insult to the ancient hierarchy. Lord Vane, an aging alpha with a scarred face and eyes burning with unchecked ambition, stepped forward from the ranks of the nobility. He was the head of the High Council, the man poised to take the throne should Garrett succumb to the blight. "My king," Vane said, bowing with deliberate slowness, a smile playing on his thin lips. "We rejoice at your return. We had feared the illness had taken you. He paused, his gaze shifting to Gabriella, his nose wrinkling in disgust. Yet, you return unbroken, trailing astray. Shall I have the guards escort the Omega to the breeding cloisters, so you may attend to the matters of state? The air in the courtyard instantly turned to absolute ice. The vanguard subtly shifted their weight, their hands resting near their weapons, sensing the sudden spike in Garrett's lethal intent. Garrett did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. If you speak of her with that tone again, Vane, I will remove your tongue and feed it to the hounds. Vane's smile vanished, replaced by a flush of angry red. Sire, the ancient laws. I am the law. Garrett cut him off, his voice a low, echoing rumble that made the stones vibrate. She walks with me. With Gabriella's hand held tightly in his, Garrett pulled her past the seething lord and the stunned court, ascending the massive obsidian stairs toward the throne room. The battle for his soul had been won in a snowy cabin, but as the heavy iron doors of the fortress loomed ahead, Gabriella knew the battle for their survival had just begun. The throne room was a cavernous expanse of polished black stone, lit only by massive braziers of roaring fire. At the far end sat a chair carved from a single, jagged block of obsidian, the crown of thorns, the seat of the Alpha King. Garrett did not let go of her hand as he marched up the dais. He didn't sit. He turned to face the heavy iron doors as they slammed shut, trapping them inside with the High Council, who had hurriedly followed them in. A dozen powerful alphas, led by a furious Lord Vane, stood at the base of the steps, their postures rigid with indignation. You push the pack to the brink of mutiny, Garrett. Vane barked, abandoning the pretense of royal titles. He gestured wildly toward Gabriella. You suffer from the feral blight. The whole territory whispers of your madness, and you bring an unmarked Omega into the sacred halls? You pollute the bloodline of the crown. My bloodline is none of your concern, Vane. Garrett replied, his voice dangerously calm. It is the concern of the pack, Vane roared, his inner beast surging to the surface, his eyes flashing a challenging, aggressive yellow. By the rights of the ancestors, a king unfit to rule, a king corrupted by the blight, must be challenged. You are weak, Garrett. You hide behind an Omega because your beast is dying. The other council members growled in agreement, their auras expanding, filling the room with the suffocating, violent pressure of an impending coup. They were trying to force a physical challenge, a battle to the death for the throne, banking on the rumors of Garrett's weakened state. Garrett's jaw locked. He stepped in front of Gabriella, shielding her with his body, his own golden eyes flaring as his claws extended with a sharp snick. He was ready to slaughter them all to protect her, but Gabriella saw the slight tremor in his hands. The blight had retreated, yes, but the sheer effort of restraining his feral wolf in a room full of challengers was pushing him back toward the edge of madness. If he fought them now, he would bathe the room in blood, confirming every fear the pack had about his sanity. She could not let him become the monster they wanted him to be. Before Garrett could lunge, Gabriella stepped out from behind his massive frame. Silence, she said. Her voice wasn't a roar. It wasn't the booming command of an alpha. It was soft, melodic, but it carried an impossible, resonant weight that cut through the aggressive growls like a silver blade through silk. Lord Vane laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. The stray speaks. Guard, remove her. Gabriella closed her eyes and stopped holding back the immense, latent energy of her caste. For her entire life, she had buried her Omega nature, taught that it was a weakness, a target. Now, she weaponized it. She pushed her aura outward in a massive, overwhelming wave. It wasn't a pressure that sought to crush, but a profound, suffocating blanket of absolute peace. It was the scent of night-blooming jasmine and ancient earth, the primal, undeniable command of a true Luna. Submit to the calm. Lay down your teeth. The effect was devastating. The aggressive alphas at the base of the dais physically faltered. Lord Vane's mocking laugh choked in his throat as his knees buckled. The instinctual, biological response to a Luna's command of peace overrode their aggressive ambition. One by one, the mighty council members collapsed to the stone floor, gasping for air as their inner beasts were forcefully lulled into submission by the sheer, terrifying purity of her aura. Gabriella opened her eyes, her gaze sweeping over the kneeling lords. The king is not mad, she declared, her voice ringing clearly through the silent hall. "He is anchored, and you will not challenge him." Garrett stood beside her, utterly motionless, staring at her with a look of profound, breathless reverence. The storm in his eyes had completely vanished, replaced by an unwavering molten gold. He turned to face the court, his presence no longer the feral, unpredictable threat of a dying beast, but the solid, unshakable foundation of a true sovereign. He reached out, taking Gabriella's small, trembling hand, and raised it high above his head for the entire council to see. "Witness your Luna," Garrett commanded, his voice echoing with absolute finality. Lord Vane, trembling against the cold stone, slowly lowered his forehead to the floor. The rest of the council followed, offering their total, undisputed submission. The rebellion was over before blood could even be drawn. The winter storm still raged against the jagged black cliffs of the Northern Territory, but the obsidian fortress was no longer a tomb of isolation. Before the roaring hearth of the royal chambers, the king who was meant to die in the snow held the Omega who had braved the blizzard to save him. Their bond had rewritten the ancient laws, proving that the true strength of a pack lay not in the ruthless subjugation of its castes, but in the balancing anchor of a destined mate. Gabriella had asked for just one night. She had been given eternity. Together, they ruled not with a crown of blood and thorns, but with a fierce, unwavering love that defied both the beast and the curse. If you were captivated by Garrett and Gabriella's journey from the frozen woods to the obsidian throne, please like this story, share it with your fellow romance readers, and subscribe for more epic tales of fated mates and undeniable love.